Well, hello, welcome to Mysterion, a special episode of Mysterion. This happy COVID Christmas time, or Advent really, we are taking advantage of not being able to get together in the studio to have some people together, some like-minded people here to have an interview discussion of sorts about Christ and ecology. And we have a couple people who we think have a lot of insights into that subject matter. So we're going to do this, and in the weeks ahead, we might do some more of these since we can't get into the studio, as I said. But we're happy to welcome a couple friends during this Advent season. And I don't know if Wes, you want to say something about Advent?
Yeah, so we chose this topic because, Advent is a season of expectation, looking forward to the coming of Christ, anticipating his incarnation and also his second coming. And so, one of the big things that Mysterion really tries to focus on is Christ is the center of all things, not only our personal experience, but the cosmos itself. And so during this Advent time, we wanted to focus on that. And also specifically, oftentimes we think about the incarnation in purely personal terms, but, there are passages throughout scripture that really discuss sort of the cosmic dimension where all of creation is in some sense involved in the drama of the coming of Christ. And we are just some voices or one voice in that larger story. So we kind of wanted to have a challenging discussion just to kind of broaden our vision during this Advent season. Before we dive in though, let me just introduce real quick. I'm going to introduce Sue, and then Ethan's going to introduce Kenneth. But Sue Sack, we've had a warm acquaintance and friendship for quite some time. I don't know, it's going on over 10 years. Yeah, a long time. We studied theology together at the University of Dayton, and Sue actually, her dissertation work was on Teilhard de Chardin, and he's got we'll be able to say more about him later, but you published a book, Teilhard in America, that is published by Catholic University of America. And she's also a pastor of adult formation at St. Helen Catholic Parish. And not only that, but she is involved in spiritual direction. And she's a master gardener, which that's like a technical term, right? Is that like that's a thing? That's not just you're a good gardener. It's something else. Like you're a Jedi gardener, right? Is that what that is? What's a master gardener? Tell me what that is.
It is a program that is put on by the extension office out of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a series of classes that you take, and then there's a volunteer component to it. So
Got you.
Commitment to do service.
So you have some community gardens and some church gardens and things like that. I'm really interested in talking to you about this topic because Teilhard is known as both a scientist and a theologian. Yeah. And you not only are immersed in his thinking, but you're also hands-on working with creation, working with the earth, and working with non-human life. And you have a lot of experience with that. So I'm interested just to see how all of this weaves together in our conversation. Before I dive in, I want to pass it on to Ethan though, so he can quick introduce Kenneth.
All right, thanks. Well, we have Pastor Kenneth Tanner, excuse me, and it's really exciting to have him with us. I've known Kenneth online from a distance for a couple of years now. A good friend of ours, Tim, and his family, they're members of Kenneth's church at Holy Redeemer. And then other friends of ours also know Kenneth, connected to him. Kenneth, if you haven't seen him online, he's all over the place. Not only is he a pastor of the church for the last 16 years, he was working with Touchstone Magazine. I think a lot of our listeners will know that, for about 16 years. Kenneth has writings in the Huffington Post, Clarion, Mockingbird, all over. He is a pastor. He also hosts, I would say, maybe the most robust theological conversations on Facebook. So he often puts these great posts on there to get people talking, very Christ-centered, very much of the type of theology Mysterion is into, very centered on spiritual life in Christ. Kenneth has a couple kids, 7 kids, couple grandkids. And as I said, he's been for the last 16 years pastor of Holy Redeemer Church. him for living in the state of Michigan, but you're welcome anyway. You're welcome anyway. Our Ohio-based podcast, but we're excited to have him. It's the first time Wes and I've actually got to interact with Kenneth, and we're really happy about that and looking forward to it. So welcome.
Good to be here.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get the conversation started here. I'm going to have a question for both of you. Maybe we can start with Sue and then move over to Kenneth. One of the great emphases of Mysterion is this idea that God becoming flesh in Jesus Christ is not plan B. This isn't God just trying to clean stuff up, but God becoming human is the point. It's plan A, right? That God would take on a body is not accidental or just an emergency tactic, but really in some sense the goal of creation from the beginning. With that in mind, what are the implications for Christ's incarnation for our relationship to the created, especially natural world? And Sue, I don't know, go with that wherever you want.
So I think what I would say first, Ethan, I feel like I am someone who is all about the incarnation. And in the sense that the incarnation to me is all about relationship. And so it's about God's relationship to the world, God's relationship to us. And when we think about incarnation and we go back and look at some of the scriptures that, in a sense, Wes was referring to before, I myself, Taylor, some of the other contemporary theologians who I read, such as Ilya Delio and Richard Rohr, would say that the incarnation in Christ could almost be looked at as the second incarnation. That the first was the creation of the world itself. When God spoke and the Word spoke and the world was created, as a student of science, also, I would say, and not being a biblical literalist, that we say that's the Big Bang. God spoke, the Big Bang started it all off. And that has to do with creation in a very broad sense. From that first incarnation, then came humanity, came us. And so from the very beginning, we are immersed in this sense of God working in the world, God in the world. Christ, Jesus, that I would call that Christ. That's Christ's first coming. Jesus is Christ's second coming, so to speak. Not second as in the future coming of Christ, but the historical coming of Christ, is yet another opportunity for us to consider how, as human beings in particular, we are to relate to God. How are we to relate to each other and to the creation that is already around us? To understand that we are so dependent on each other, and without each other, there is nothing. We have nothing. We are nothing.
All right. Thank you. Kenneth, does that spark anything for you in a place you want to go with that question, or if you want to riff off anything Sue did there?
Yeah, So I appreciate how in On the Incarnation, Athanasius, right straight away, identifies the one who is creating the world with the title Savior. So that there is a sense right from the beginning that it's the crucified one who creates. There's this very lively sense that the Son of God, the Logos, is from the get-go the crucified Lord of history. And so that requires us to sort of full time, in the sense that how is from the foundation of the cosmos is the lamb slain. And so that Jesus, the incarnate one knit in the womb of the Virgin by the Spirit, is the prototype for Adam and not the other way around. He is the embodiment of what it means to be human from the beginning, Alpha and Omega. So, yeah, I definitely, affirm what Sue is saying about this intimacy between God and the world, the Creator and the cosmos, and that the entire thing is like a reflection, a refraction off of the self-emptying of God for what he loves, the creation he loves. He makes creation good. He is good. And then he becomes a part of the creation. The potter becomes clay. He makes humanity in love, and he becomes human. So I'm always going back to this idea that Bonhoeffer was really good at articulating, which is that humanity as a project seems to be wanting to leave the world and escape the created order and the material, and to some, I was raised Pentecostal, and getting out of here and going to heaven in some disembodied state was very much at the center of our religion. And here I was confronted, when I was at Oral Roberts University with Irenaeus and his in recapitulation, and we're seeking to escape the world. God becomes human. He enters the world. He becomes flesh, and really forever, identifies himself with human persons. So Nissa says, the sky is not an image of God. The mountains are not an image of God. The creature, the beasts are not an image of God. The human is, he puts his image in the human. Yeah, it's identifies himself forever. He doesn't stop being human. He ascends in human flesh to the right hand of the Father, and forever is embodied as a human being. And so, against all of our judgments about ourselves, people judge us, our own hearts, the evil forces of wickedness that judge humanity, God stands with humanity squarely against all that opposes humanity.
So let me ask, and it's related to both of your guys' answers. I'm gonna just start off with Sue's word relationship. There's a lot of discussion today about our relationship to the natural world. Questions about ecology, conversations about sustainability, right? And yet somehow it seems to me that somehow our relationship with Jesus Christ is I don't know how to say it, it's a very different conversation that we're having than the conversation we're having about our relationship to the natural world. But it seemed to me, Sue, that you're saying that that's not right, right? So somehow this all needs to be one conversation that we're having. And I'm just wondering if you might respond. I mean, one question we can ask is, why do you think these two conversations, our relationship with Christ and our relationship with the, I'll just call it the ecological world, is become two different conversations? If you don't want to answer that question, then say maybe how can they become one question? I don't know, there's a couple of couple of questions I'm offering up to you to respond.
Yeah. So I will start my answer by saying that a good friend of my husband's is a member of a church that is affiliated with Restoration Park. And when my husband mentioned to him that I was going to be having this discussion with you all, and he asked, well, what is it about? And I said, well, it's about God and theology and ecology and gardening. And he said, I would never have put all those in the same sentence. And I said, well, yeah, okay. And for me, I can't imagine taking them out of the same sentence. Right? And so it's so difficult for me to pull the threads out west to answer that question very well. Because from the as far back as I can remember, okay, you mentioned, you know, it is humanity that is the how did you put it, is the reflection of God, right?
The human is where he's invested
Yeah.
his image, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
the image of God. See,
Yeah.
for me, I look at the natural world and I see the image of God.
Yeah.
God's fingerprints are all over that.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the Alpha and the Omega, again, going back to the Alpha, the point of creation, and Taylor talks about this, you know, that we are moving towards this Omega point. There's there's this teleology going on, and then we're progressing that way. But everything, all of creation is on that same path, that we can't disassociate ourselves from the created world or anything else. So, you know, from the very beginning of my life, there was just this awareness that there was something very sacred. I use the word sacred, something very sacred about the natural world. That and it is amazing to me as a gardener, as a farmer, that when I plant a seed in the soil, that it grows. Okay? And that is I make the effort to put the seed in the soil, but that is not me making that plant grow. You know, God has invested God's self in this process.
Yeah.
To provide that food for us. Or the complexity of a flower, watching, I have birthed many baby goats, watching that birth, I mean, it's astonishing. And I have totally lost track of what I'm supposed to be answering.
That's all right.
I did a West.
I hear you.
Can you redirect me, please?
I'll let Ethan.
Okay.
Well, you know, we were talking about like not pulling these conversations apart, like Christ, gardening, ecology,
right.
How these things all go together.
How does it all go together? Right.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
I hopefully have answered that fairly well, I hope. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Kenneth, I'm gonna direct this at you. This is maybe not one of the questions we threw out, but it's what Sue had me thinking about. You briefly mentioned the potter becomes the clay, like God, that soil that Sue talks about, it looks like it's dead, but it gives forth life, and God becomes one with the dust of the earth when he becomes human, and then even perhaps more profoundly when he dies. But also I'm one with that dust, right? You and I, that's where we come from. That's where we're going.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something about spiritual life and that recognition that on the one hand, I'm just sort of dust that can walk around for a little while, then returns to dust. But on the other hand, God too has taken up dust into God's life, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's animated clay. And God loves what he makes, and God becomes what he makes. That's the humility of that, the vulnerability of that, the condescension of that. If you're God, to become human is to take on disability. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, So limitation, something human beings really strive hard against. God embraces limits. Example. We're told that the sun speaks everything that is into existence, comes from the mind of God and by words, the sun and the moon, the stars and the constellations and everything, which were not in one moment were. It's poetry, but evolution. It's not at odds with quantum physics or anything. It's just at what moment. In fact, that's the way most science describes it. One moment there was nothing, and all of a sudden there was something. And we trust that comes from the voice of God, the word of God. Everything, the grass, the trees, the beasts, the birds, the fish, the whole 9 yards, which we are, absolutely integrated with in ways that indigenous people understand better than a lot of Western people. And so, yes, it's a beautiful, I love everything she's saying about, we're absolutely integrated with all of it. But imagine if you speak everything to existence, submitting to silence. In the womb of the Virgin, God becomes silent, can't speak. He emerges into the world of humanity and blood and serum and breast milk and everything else. And he's unable to speak. He has to learn to speak from his mother, his human mother. Words like Emma and Abba and all of these things. And eventually, once his mind, by integration with her, her care for him, as my friend Scott Erickson says, God decides that we're going to take care of him for a while. She doesn't feed him, he dies. She doesn't swallow him against the cold, he dies. He's as contingent and really human. He's not Superman. He's as really human as any of us are. And eventually, once he learns to speak, all this wisdom starts coming from him, such that the priests in the temple and other people say, who is this? At 12 years old. But there was a season where the one who spoke everything into existence can't speak. And so it's just the humility of it blows my mind.
Well, just thinking about that, I mean, the humility, and also one of the words that came to my mind when you were speaking there, Kenneth, was vulnerability. I think many of us today are kind of informed that the non-human world is vulnerable in a way that maybe we're never aware of before. I mean, I can imagine when human beings weren't as powerful as we are now, there's a sense of in which all of creation was just terribly powerful, right? Our lives were threatened in many ways by the natural world, and then suddenly over the last 100 years, 150 years, we find, even though yes, we still in some ways in the Western more modern age, we still are threatened by the natural world, but there's a sense in which we're aware that the natural world, the non-human world, is vulnerable too, right?
Oh yeah.
And I'm just wondering, I never thought before just this moment, is there a relationship between Christ's vulnerability and the fact that we realize now that our natural world is also vulnerable? It's not, it's not omnipotent, it's part of creation just like us, and it's frail like us. I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that. I know just off the top of my head, but seems to be a connection there between Christ's vulnerability in his incarnation, the fact that we realize the created world is itself vulnerable, right?
And I think we're seeing that brand new, aren't we? that we ourselves, as part of the created world, are vulnerable in a new way.
Mhm.
You know, we have been in whatever you want to call this period, the Great Reset, as I like to call it, recognizing a new vulnerability, both because of COVID, but also as time goes by, the changes in our climate, you know, and as someone who farms and gardens and raises fruit, especially, I see those changes in my trees. And I think, what are we going to do in 20 years if this continues? You know, and we're paying $2 a piece for apples. How is that going to work? Right. So, and I loved what you said about humility and vulnerability, Kenneth. But I want to turn that backwards too, because I think that is something that recognizing our codependence with the natural world teaches us too. The humility of being so dependent upon those little seeds and the weather, and trusting that the rain will come when it's supposed to come. You know, and trusting that we will have the nourishment that we need to stay healthy even. And it reminds us that we are not God. We cannot make ourselves in the image of into gods, right? Whatever else we might be able to do, we still have that vulnerability ourselves. We still need to be humble in that way.
That's an illusion that we're not
Yes,
dependent
it is.
on the creation, made possible by many of us in this culture not being farmers, not being gardeners, not being involved in animal husbandry, and care for the earth. So not even naturalists or conservationists or anything else. We're just consumers, you know, and so we're cut off from all of those processes, and can imagine for a time. I think it's less easy to do with COVID and everything that's going on, but we could imagine that we're invulnerable. It's the same thing. The problem of we have in the culture with death. We're divorced from any kind of village life where we would see people die, or we would we would prepare their bodies for burial at home, dig in the earth to bury them. Everything is very sanitized, so that the doctors and the hospitals and the undertakers and the funeral people do all of that work, and so we I frequently give prayers for people who their family didn't show up at the hospital. There wasn't anybody there when they died. We do funerals and nobody goes to the graveside, and so there's this, we ourselves, and our connection to the ground, because of all of these ways, we are cut off from the land. I mean, how many people take their shoes off and walk in, the dirt every day, just as something that you could do to ground yourself. This is a spiritual practice. We were talking earlier about practical spiritual practices. That would be a pretty good spiritual practice, to find some actual ground, not asphalt or, cement or, and take your shoes off, and walk around and feel the connection with the earth,
I was thinking as you guys were talking about that, I think sometimes when we think about salvation, maybe especially in the tradition Wes and I are from, we think maybe ultimate salvation will free us from that codependent relationship on the created order. But we believe in the resurrection of the dead. Our relationship to the dust of the earth is forever, right? And so our care for its ability to nurture life, is not something other than seeking the life of Christ in us, right? Yeah. And to this day, when we celebrate and Christ comes in our midst in our worship services, it's from stuff that grows out of the ground.
Right.
That's never going to change, right? The whole created world, we're looking for its redemption. And so
What's the controlling metaphor for Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 for resurrection?
Yeah,
It's about seeds being planted in the ground
right.
and
Yeah,
dying.
Yeah, so
yeah,
this relationship you guys have articulated is not a tragic relationship to the created order, to the dust. It's for Christians, this is forever.
right.
Hope.
This will
It's
be part
hopeful.
of the eternal.
I would say, salvation comes not from escaping the world, but by immersing oneself further into the incarnation, into the incarnate world. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, so I mean, in the last few decades, you sometimes had people say, well, we're Christians, we believe in this, that, Jesus will come back. What's it matter? Why do we need to care for the natural world? But if it's the incarnate one we're looking for, if we're looking to share in the resurrection, nurturing the well-being of our bodies and our spirits is not something other than nurturing the well-being
Right.
of the living environment around us and its ability to be hospitable, say, to the next generation and so forth. All of that is the embrace of the life of Christ in us. And it's not something other than our spiritual lives, right?
Right.
So let
Yeah,
me
and
go ahead.
yeah,
Ken.
go. No, I was just going to say, I mean, I was raised and many Catholics were raised with this too in America, but certainly Pentecostals and evangelicals and Baptists were raised with the idea that, God is just going to destroy the world. And so, who cares what happens to the creation? We're all getting out of here. We're going to heaven. And so it totally informs the way people imagine the earth and the universe and so forth and so on, instead of what the scriptures actually say, which is that God descends from where he is, and his dwelling is here on earth with humankind, and all the nations gather together around God, and so that God, there's a new heavens, a new earth. That, they bring Thessalonians into it, and like everything's going to melt away, and so forth and so on. But the metaphor there is a new creation. It's just like I mean, we've been baptized in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he doesn't eliminate every cell of our body, or doesn't start from scratch. And we're new creations. He renews us, he restores us. If we look at the whole scriptural record, God's a renovating God, a restoring God, and so this is what our trust is about the earth and about us. And he's going to come to renew the face of the earth and make it new, like new, but even of course transfigured and more beautiful, and everything else, things that we can't even see now that exist, that are visible to our limitation.
So I think, part of this, I think part of the problem is, and that we've been pointing out, is a problem in our beliefs. They're limited in some sense, or maybe like we said, there's certain things about the gospel that have been left out or forgotten. That I think this conversation is good, because we're rightfully bringing those back into conversation about who Christ is and who we are in relationship to him. Part of the problem as well, though, is not just our beliefs, but you might say there's things in our spiritual life, spiritual practice, that have also been separated somehow. The non-human creation often is not necessarily something that we have integrated well into our spiritual lives. And so I was curious, especially maybe you could start, Sue, just as someone who practices garden, as a master gardener who's producing. I have the thing here. He says 30 tons of organic produce for local food pantries have been produced from your gardening. So I think you've got a lot to say maybe about the way in which gardening is in some sense can open our eyes in our actual way of being in relationship to God. That there's spiritual practices and riches and treasures there. Maybe you can say something about some of that.
Right. And I would say, for myself, my spiritual life has been focused not so much on the word, and part of that is being Catholic, right? That my focus has been more It's about what you do, and it's about how you live. And that is really what I, especially the last 40 years, have tried very hard to do. How do you live? And my desire has been to live in a way that honors and respects the incarnation wherever I find it. So my relationships with people, especially, are very crucial. My relationship, of course, to God through those people and through what I find around me, the life I find around me, however that manifests itself. You know, so gardening is a way to hands-on build those relationships. And at the same time, as someone who, someone mentioned this earlier, that we pull apart, I think it was you, Kenneth, we pull apart our lives and we put the spiritual over here and we put the physical here, you know, and we put the intellectual over here. How do we bring those together to live those in a very cohesive way, right? So by hands-on gardening, I get the physical, and I'm feeding myself and so many others there. I am feeding myself spiritually, because hands in the ground, it is like, very much like the potter with the clay. I look at soil, I don't see it as being dead. I see it as very much alive, and it is alive with the Spirit of God that is going to produce these incredible things for us, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so
Filled with his energies.
yes, yes. So it feeds us, and then I turn around and feed the soil through my efforts and by the way I treat it also. You know, it is this symbiotic relationship in so many ways.
So you're a co-creator.
Co-creation, thank you. Yes,
Yes.
wanted to bring that up.
And
Absolutely, co-creating with God.
and what do we find the resurrected human
Yeah,
doing in John's
absolutely.
gospel? What does Mary mistake him for?
Yes.
Right. So at the beginning, I'm gonna, hopefully you guys will let me share, but here's Dore, excuse me, Albert Dürer, and you know his illustration of Mary, you know, discovering Jesus, the resurrected Christ, and he's got a shovel and
The gardener in the garden. Yes.
yeah, and I mean there's, you know, many fine works that, you know, bring this
Yes, thank you.
that, you know, yeah, it's astounding to me that we, you know, it's very clearly she mistakes him for the gardener because he's on his knees, you know, working with the chrysanthemums or whatever it is, you know, he's doing, and very much has his hands on the soil,
Right.
you know, and then she, you know, she he's gotten back to the human vocation, right? And so, you know, Wes, you know, you keep referring to this non-human creation. Do we, like, I wonder, like art, you know, we think about like the works of Michelangelo, or, you know, whether it's sculpture, paintings, or whatever. And we say, you know, we call that's the product of humans, right? That's a human artistic, like the, you know, the cross that's hanging there in your office, and the icons behind Ethan are human crafts, but it's the human God who makes the world. So, you know, is there anything that doesn't have the finger? I mean, it was the fingerprints of God. I mean, actually, the fingerprints of God on it. I think we need to think a little bit more about the humanity of God and in creation, and that all of creation and cosmos is the work of a particular human who is God.
And also, I would add to that, you know, just the idea that the water that flows through our bodies, that flows in our veins,
Yeah.
you know, that all of creation is dependent upon that same source of water. That interconnection that science has shown us.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to what you said about art. And, you know, that's the other thing about gardening that it does for me. It's a very creative process also. and it creates my point is whatever it is I am growing, whatever it is, however it is I'm gardening, it's about creating something of beauty. So it might be the visible beauty of just the pattern of the vegetables or the flowers or the colors, but also the beauty of the community that is also involved in doing that. You know? And God, it might sound very Platonic, but God is about very much about beauty for me, the good and the beautiful.
Yeah, and it takes the soil, and it takes the light, and it takes the water, and it takes the manipulation of care for the soil, and human cooperation,
Mhm.
and co-creation.
I think,
I was with, sorry, Wes,
no, go ahead.
so I got on this airplane in Bend last September, which feels like 3 years ago, from speaking at something, and I sat down, and this young woman sat down next to me. Was reading David Bentley Hart's "That All Shall Be Saved," and she sat down and said, "What's that book?" You know, and I also have this book that I'm reading about Indigenous people, and their American Indigenous people and their practices and spiritual. And she was really interested in some. She started telling me that she is an oceanographer, and and a documentary filmmaker, at Oregon State University, which is there in Bend, and she made films on like glaciers, and she's made films on coral reefs and nanoplastics and all these things. Really interesting person. She said, "Father, one of the mistakes we've made in ecology and in the climate, change movement, is to make humans the enemies of the earth, and the earth the enemy of human beings." She said, what the science shows us is that the creation thrives with the presence of human beings. And this idea that there's a competition between the two instead of this everything working together to bring life has made a certain group of humans sort of oppositional towards the earth and towards nature, because the way we presented things and she says it's just not true. And I was thinking about that last night, thinking about this is if there's a human God who makes it, of course it thrives with the presence of God's image bearers, within it and working it and participating in it. But of course, not just using it up, and wasting it, and poisoning it, and destroying it. So anyway, Wes, you've tried to say 2 or 3 things now with me
No,
blathering on.
people have heard enough of me. I'd rather have you guys speak. One of the questions I had was about patience, because my wife has been primarily the one driving us to get more into the practice of gardening and producing our own food and things like that. And one of the things I realized that is how long it takes and how patient you have to be. And I was thinking as well about how oftentimes it seems to me like the kinds of practices of producing the food that we currently driving most of the food industry, eliminate the need for patience, right?
Right.
I mean, it's a wonderful thing. I mean, I have to say, I can go and eat strawberries in December. I mean, that's fabulous. I could make like all kinds of things, I remember my grandfather's British, and he said that the one thing he'd love to get for Christmas, his best present was an orange.
Mhm.
That was a treasure, an orange,
Right.
Now, I can get an orange anytime I want, so it's a wonderful thing. But to be able to have all these things at hand and not to be in need or in want that way.
Right.
And yet this inability to live a lifestyle of, I say, patience, right? Of not being able to have access to all these things. Part of the reason, that's part of what's got us into some of this trouble. And so I was just wondering maybe if there's some connection between patience as a spiritual practice, in the commands in scripture about learning the way of patience as God being patient with us, right? Participating in God's patience. Maybe there's a connection there with how we learn to relate in a healthy way to the world around us. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that. That was bouncing around in my mind when you guys were speaking.
I say absolutely. You are right on there. Um, and I think that 40 years of living this way have shaped me in so many ways that I don't even recognize, right? Because it's just part of the flow. And patience is definitely one of those. You put a fruit tree in the ground, or I just went, I just went and planted some persimmons. Okay. Well, persimmons will take 10 years to start producing. We won't be here by that point. Well, but to wait and to watch and to know that this is coming helps you to really take that long view of life. And also, I think just participating in the cycles of the seasons, like you mentioned with the strawberries, and to learn to live much, we're all about supposedly living in the moment now. And that really teaches you to live in the moment. This is the season for strawberries. This is when you're going to have them.
Right.
In the fall, you can have pumpkins. You don't need strawberries in the fall. We'll gorge on pumpkins and pumpkin spice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now it's nuts. Go eat all your nuts. Um, but when you have a crop that fails, when you have a bad growing season, there's also, or like has happened to us, all of our goats die like that. There is the realization that there's next year, right? This is just part of it. This is, and going back to the idea of separating ourselves, the spiritual from the physical, I think when we lose that, we lose those virtues. I mean, they really get depleted.
Would you
And
say you're less anxious?
yes, absolutely, because I know it's going to work. Eventually, it'll work out. We're going to be okay. We've had
Because
some really
I
rough
think
years.
patience and anxiety is the opposite, right? Of the virtue of patience.
Yes, I would say so.
And we live in a very anxious world. I think, and I was just reading, it's really great. If you guys want to read a good book, Our Only World, these
Mm,
new essays by Wendell. And he talks in there, in his last essay in there, about the difference between predicting the future and providing for the future. And how this is constant prediction, which is what everybody wants, is predicting the future, what leads to anxiety. But providing, for the future is works patience and hope. It's a hope in us, as we're who knows what the future is, but we do know from the past that in the present moment we have to provide for the future. And so it's like, if we had a lot more we had just a lot more humans working to provide for the future rather than trying to predict it, which no one's been very good at. That would be a good place to start, is in the moment, like, what do we need to do to provide for tomorrow? And that's what you're describing, Sue, is like, okay, well, this is now the time to plant potatoes, because we know St. Patrick's Day is the time to plant potatoes, because we know from the past that starvation is a possibility.
yeah,
And we don't know if we'll have a bumper crop or not, but we better get them in the ground.
but maybe not in Michigan.
Yeah.
Not
So,
on St. Patrick's Day.
no.
It strikes me, we kind of started this conversation out, Wes and I did, thinking about how believing in the incarnation changes our relationship to the created world, and how the created world, the natural world especially, helps us relate to God. But what's interesting to me is how your conversation, the two of you, has taken us to this place where I would almost summarize it this way and say, thinking ecologically about spiritual life means we can't truly obey the commandment to love thy neighbor without taking seriously the condition of the natural world around us, right? How on earth, especially with the kind of power, Wes, as we have now to affect the natural world, if we're going to take seriously the commandments, that central command, then what we do with the trees or the dying insect population or all these things. Like that's in there. That's in that command, right?
Just love your grandchildren and your great grandchildren. Again, we have this idea that, Christ is coming back and the world's coming to an end in our lifetime, which the first Christians thought too. Guess what? No. And we don't like think, what world are we leaving to 3015? That's where we need to start, thinking, because God is patient with existence and with humanity and with the world. Who knows how long this is going to go on? And she was right. $2 apples is not economically feasible. So
Yeah.
you have to provide for the future.
Mhm.
So if you have a hard time imagining doing that for your neighbor, well, maybe start imagining doing it for your great grandchildren or your great great grandchildren.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, I think there is a sense, there is a lot of discussion about this in the, public world at large, about, sustainability and trying to be more attentive to, right now we're talking primarily about food production and consumption and things like that. And I think a lot of that's because there's a sense that there's something amiss and there's a lack, there's a disconnection with the world around us, and something's not quite right. And of course, we can look at very concrete examples of this playing out in history. My question is as you two are pastors, and are attempting to respond to this from a place of spiritual direction, and in encouraging people's faith and love for Christ, how as pastors can you feel like you provide I would say a unique voice or a helpful voice in trying to answer this problem or this need?
Oh, I was going to let you go first this time.
I feel like I'm talking way too much. Well, sacramentally is where I would start. The bread and the wine that must be grown and crushed and kneaded and vented and all these things, and put on the altar. The recognition, a connection between all of that, like even blessing your meals, thinking about the hands that grew and harvested and tended to the land and so forth and so on. I went into a grocery store a few years ago, one of these gourmet grocery stores. You probably have maybe you've been in, haven't been in, but I mean all the high end, everything that farmers and butchers and cheesemakers and winemakers and everything put. It's just a massive. And I felt like just like, I don't know what uneasiness was what I was seeing. This cornucopia of produce and everything. And I was like, well, why would that be? This is all good. The cheese and the fruit and the breads and everything is part of God's creation. I shouldn't be upset by this. But I really felt like, I don't know if Amos or somebody vibrating inside of the spirit or something, but I recognized there was no gratitude for it. No recognition of all the labor that took to produce and make it and put it there. It's just people just picking stuff up and then making their food, and just not really understanding their connection with all of this. And I think God is grieved because there's this lack of gratitude and connection. And I just think we have to get back to helping people understand, because if we wait, this is, oh, let's get the government to do this, or let's get, these corporations to do this or whatever. No, everybody needs to figure out what they're doing. My children have helped us with this to some extent. I think we have much more conversion left to do. But it's just as important what we're doing with our trash. This is important what we're doing with all of these things. And They have their compost and all these things, all these small things, and they grow food. All the young people in our church, make a bit, even here in Michigan, make a big business of growing a lot of their own, food. So raising their own animals and so forth, and they're all into it. And I think these are all hopeful things, and we can encourage people to get involved in these small things. Waiting for the government, waiting for corporations, that's not providing for the future. That's like putting it off on somebody else. And I mean, it'd be wonderful to have everybody cooperating at those levels and so forth and so on. But I think as leaders in the church, we have to start encouraging people in these small ways.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Kenneth. I also want to comment that, we have this thing called Catholic social teaching. And this is one of the tenets of Catholic social teaching is care for the earth. So it's built right in there. You will do this. You will pay attention to this. And as a pastor, I think me being me, my response to that has been, okay, so let's do this. How do we do this? In a very physical, experiential way. And so I've done that by starting these gardens. I've done that by taking people on trips into the wilderness. We have heard in the last few years about the benefits of what they call forest baths, right? Just going out and walking in the trees. I mean, that's a real thing. Like you mentioned, taking off your shoes and walking on the earth to ground yourself, to encourage people to do those very simple things. I agree. I have been so thrilled to watch all these families suddenly start growing gardens this year, or going camping, and reconnecting in that very physical way with the natural world, to reestablish those relationships. And it's kind of like, this year with the election, we struggled with how do we overcome the divisiveness? Well, you start by talking to each other, by interacting with those people who seem to be on the other side of the fence. And as you talk with them, or how do you get to know somebody from another culture? You talk with them, you create relationships. And when you do that, you start to realize, oh, they're not so bad. They've got a lot of good things going there. And it seems to me that when you get people to, if nothing else, to plant a basil plant in a pot and put it on their patio, and it grows and thrives, and suddenly they can make a pesto and they have this great spaghetti sauce. Like, oh, this isn't so bad. This is pretty cool, right? Or if they manage to go out and participate in a planted tree day, and then they go back and visit that tree and it's thriving, and it's like, wow, we've got this relationship going. So that's what I think what we have to do. Like Kenneth said, we just need to encourage people in very practical ways, as well as the sacramental ways, to do that.
And I think what you guys are doing at Mysterion with getting people to recognize that some of the Greek there's Maximus and Nyssa and others, and how they ground all this in creation and Christ in creation. And of course, we can also look to modern folks like Tilliard to help us make those connections. But we can also look at even in our own country, a really good work is called Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teaching of Plants, by this woman who's a botanist and also a Native American, and a tremendous amount of wisdom to help us understand, to understand the connectedness of everything, and of course in the human God, in the person of Jesus. And
I think that's so much what it's about. It's that interconnectedness, the connectedness of everything. This truly this web that binds us all together, and it binds us together through the Incarnation.
Yeah, thank you both so much. As you were saying that, I was just thinking there's an anonymous quote from one of the Desert Fathers who lived out in the country that I've labored for 20 years in prayer to see all of humanity as one.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that a lot of the stuff you guys just named is part of that prayerful labor to have that vision,
Right.
to see ourselves together as one, because we are one in the dirt, right? We are one in the dust of the earth. So we need to wrap up. It's been great having you both. Sue, always great to see you. Kenneth, great to finally meet you. But I want to give maybe Sue the last word. She's got a unique opportunity here because she went through many PhD seminars with one Wes Ardblaster. And if she's got a great, funny, or embarrassing story, that would be a good way to end this episode. I mean, this is your chance, Sue.
Oh, Wes, do I want to do that to you?
Oh no, Sue, you've been such a kind soul so far. Are you gonna?
Come on, we're now you've piqued our interest.
Oh,
Um,
the only story I want to say, and it's not that bad, Wes. It's sitting in that first seminar with Portier. And I don't even remember what we were talking about. But you were in the thick of it. You were really, really going, and the hands were flying, and your voice was going up and down and up and down. And in the middle of all of that, you stopped and you looked at me and you go, "What?" I said, "Nothing. I'm just trying to listen." He goes, "You've just got that look on your face like you have no idea what you don't have any idea what you're saying." And I thought, no, I don't have any idea what's going on here.
You were always we talk about patience. You were always very patient, and yeah, I'm over there yelling and throwing my arms around, and you're quietly listening.
Yeah. I'm like, I know there's a lot of wisdom here. I know there is.
Somewhere. You got to dig in there somewhere to try to find it. You got to do a lot of work to get that out.
There was a lot of wisdom. You taught me a lot. Tremendous.
Oh, it's you know what? It was really great, the conversation with you guys. And this conversation needs to keep going. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen, if we can return to it sometime soon. But I would love to, because I think that there's so much. I mean, I think we just touched this whole thing.
yeah, just scratching the surface of this topic. I mean, yeah.
And it's so spiritually deep. I think one of the things that's so rich. I mean, I think one of the things that we Christians haven't been in the practice of thinking through these things on a spiritual level. And so, people see Christ in ecology and they're like, well, what is that? And like, how are those things connected? It's like, these are so deeply connected. The life of Jesus Christ and his creation is such a deep and intimate relationship, as you said, Sue, that to me, not only does it open my eyes to how I should begin to see the non-human world through spiritually, but also how this feeds my spirit, considering these things, how it opens up these really basic scriptural commandments, like being patient, being, Christ being gentle and lowly, and us taking that on in our lives. I don't mean to get preachy. I'm just saying it's been a really great conversation.
Can I just add one more thing to that too? Because
Yeah.
I know you both are very, very interested in the Desert Fathers, among others, and what we're talking about here is truly developing a contemplative form of life, right?
Yeah.
That is very aware of truly Christ incarnate and all those things around us. So,
It's the contemplation of God's humanity
absolutely.
that has
Thing.
that is crucial
Mhm.
and that is very much absent. It doesn't matter whether you're Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox,
Yeah.
Baptist, Methodist, Anabaptist, whatever, Presbyterian, Methodist. I can only speak for America. I'm not an expert on the world, but very much missing part of what it means to be a disciple is to contemplate the humanity of God. And when we do that, the connections are endless to the created order.
Absolutely.
Well, you all, we wish you a happy Advent and a Merry Christmas, and probably won't see you before then. But we'll see if we can pull this conversation together again. I'd love to have a second part or a third part.
It'd be fun.
And you give me a call when you're ready to put that garden in over there.
Oh, we've got it. We're getting bigger this year. We'll be calling you. We'll be
30 tons. That's just really just family. Your family.
No. That's
Or your
they
collective.
have 3 different gardens.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic.
All right, thanks.
blessings.